Me for this presentation today on the U.S. refugee and asylum system. And I really want to focus on those aspects of the U.S. immigration system, although I'm happy to talk about other aspects of the immigration system as well. U.S. immigration, most immigration systems, but U.S. immigration in particular is a complex beast. And so there's so many elements. And so I'm going to focus on the elements that I do most of my research on, which is the experiences of refugees and asylum seekers in the United States, although as I said, I'm happy to talk about those other elements as well. So as a quick introduction, I am Sara McKinnon. I am an associate professor in the Department of Communication Arts at UW-Madison, and I do research on refugee and immigration issues in the United States and in Mexico, Central America, that sort of region. So the Americas, broadly speaking. And today I'm going to talk about what this system is and to try to give us a sense of the history of it, but also what's happening today. And so what I want to do in my time with you is to briefly set the stage, the historical stage for this system of allowing refugees to be in the United States. And then I'm going to talk about changes that were made to this system, both during the Trump presidency and then the Biden administration. So I'll try to kind of walk through changes that have been happening within the last few years to give us a sense of the contemporary view of this system. I think what's important to recognize about the US system to admit refugees and asylum seekers is that it really emerges out of the aftermath of World War II. So in the aftermath of World War II, world leaders came together and said, you know, we have a problem. We have a problem with how it is human rights are respected and how it is we understand the relationship between the rights of individuals in relation to states. And so many world leaders came together to draft and create policies around the idea of human rights. So the Human Rights Convention is an important document for understanding the experiences and the rights of refugees and asylum seekers today. So this is the preamble that I have on the slide. What's even more important are Articles 13 and 14. And these are the articles in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which really are talking about the right to movement and the right to seek asylum. So Article 13 says that everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. And Article 14 states that everyone has the right to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. What these articles don't define, however, is the right to receive asylum. So that they say, you know, you as an individual have the right to move and you have the right to seek asylum. But when we think about receiving asylum and being given the ability to remain permanently in a country, this document, the Declaration of Human Rights, does not do that. What world leaders decided is to rely on nations to decide how to implement those measures. And so in Article 14, whereas everyone has the right to seek asylum, they do not have the right to receive asylum. That right, the right to decide who gets to receive it, remains in the hands of nation states. And so here we have this sort of gap between the rights of the individuals and the rights of the nation states. And this continuously becomes one of the challenges of implementing reliefs for refugees and asylum seekers in the past and still today. Another convention that emerged from the aftermath of World War II was the 1951 definition of a refugee. So in addition to outlining the Articles of Human Rights, right? What does an individual entitled to? World leaders also tried to set about identifying who constituted a refugee. And from this emerged the definition that you see on the screen. I've highlighted the categories of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion because those are really important to the way in which asylum seekers in the United States either have the right to receive asylum or the right to, or are excluded from asylum. So asylum means experiencing persecution, but that persecution has to be grounded in some sort of category that's outlined here, some sort of claim. And so this can be a place that's really challenging, right, as refugees, in particular asylum seekers, begin to try to make a claim for their right to remain in the United States. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute as I talk about how this has been implemented. Okay, so that's a bit of the broad history. The more recent history is the 1980 Refugee Act. This is the piece of legislation in the United States that really put into place the system for accepting refugees and asylum seekers that we have today. So this act did many things. Mostly it streamlined how it is that refugees and asylum seekers were being admitted to the United States, but it created in particular two processes for refugees. And so I want to talk about those two processes because I think this is a part of what can be confusing about immigration in the United States. The 1980 Refugee Act created one process, which I'll talk about as refugee resettlement, and a second process, which is talked about as asylum or asylum seeking. So I want to explain both of those processes, and I'll talk about how policies have shifted in the last few years toward both of those elements. Let's start with refugee resettlement. And so refugee resettlement, and I want you to focus on this blue arrow at the top here. So refugee resettlement happens when there is a long-term conflict outside of the United States. This has been going on for many, many, many years. It's forced individuals to have to flee their home country often to a neighboring country. And these individuals remain in refugee camps or settlements for years. It gets to be to the point where the international community along with aid workers and various groups say, you know, there is no end in sight to this conflict. There's no feasible way in which stability is going to return to one's country. And so they begin the process of thinking about resettling those individuals who are in refugee camps in the United States in a long-term way. So this happens when a group of refugees from a particular country, recently Somalia has been a country, Syria has been talked about as a country, Burma. I mean, there's a number of countries where we can say like, there's no end in sight to the instability here. So they're identified by the International Rescue Committee, the Red Cross, various groups for potential resettlement. Even before they leave the refugee camp, they go through all of this processing. So the US Department of State reviews and screens. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee does some screenings. The Department of Homeland Security does screenings. And finally, if the individuals and the groups are cleared, they may be admitted for refugee resettlement. So this happens oftentimes when we see kind of large groups of communities who are resettled. That's really what we're talking about. I think what's important is that to recognize is that kind of go through all of this processing, then they are connected with volunteer agencies. They're talked about as VOLAGs. These are agencies like the International Rescue Committee, Catholic Social Services, Lutheran Immigrant and Refugee Services. There's a number of these volunteer agencies who kind of serve as caseworkers and help the communities resettle and adjust to life in the United States. This gives you a map of a lot of the common places where refugees are resettled in the United States. So you'll see in Madison, for example, we certainly have refugee agencies that are doing this work, Wausau, Milwaukee, and I can talk more about the Madison refugee resettlement system if you're interested during the Q&A. So this gives you a sense. I think what's important to recognize is refugees resettled in the US don't have a choice. They can't say like, oh, I want to go to Omaha, Nebraska. The volunteer organization identifies where there's a need. Oftentimes we're talking about an economic need for people to work, and there's a social system there, and that's kind of how placement happens. So in a moment, I'll talk about how this system has changed a little bit, but I want to give us a broad sense of who has been admitted. So this kind of gives you, this map gives you a sense of, through the refugee resettlement program, in the last few years, the kind of continents, and this is a way in which we can kind of see who's been admitted. So there are various points, communities from Africa, African nations that have been resettled. I think that was definitely increasing around 2015, 2016. You see kind of in 2003, maybe more European refugee resettlement, less so in 2015, and so forth. So I'm also happy to talk about those trends, and I'll spend some more time at the end of the talk discussing more recent figures and what those look like. The second system that the 1980 Refugee Act implemented was a system for asylum seekers. So asylum seekers happen or come to be when an individual or maybe a family, so it's usually a small unit, arrives at or within the borders of the United States, and they say, I am fleeing persecution. I need a right to remain in the United States because of this persecution. And then there's this whole process that that happens. But unlike the refugee resettlement program, these are individuals that apply for the right to be recognized as an asylum seeker, which is kind of a subcategory of a refugee, right? They apply at or within the borders of the United States. So that's the key difference if we're thinking about refugee resettlement and asylum seekers. Again, to be recognized as an asylum seeker, to be granted asylum, they have to make the argument that their experiences fit this definition of a refugee. So they have to have well-founded fear of persecution. That's number one, and evidence of that. And that persecution has to be on the basis of one of these categories, so race, religion, nationality, membership in a social group, or political opinion. And the rest of it is kind of like legalese, but those elements are really important. And when we look at asylum seekers' cases, the majority of what's happening is the construction of an argument, the construction of a narrative for how one's experiences fit this definition. And as you can imagine, some experiences are easier to fit within this than others. And so this is where we see lots of interesting legal cases emerge as a result. And I can definitely talk about that. That's one of my areas of expertise, in particular, those fleeing gender-based or sexuality-related asylum. So I can talk about that more if you're interested in those elements later on. The other thing that I think is important to recognize with the 1980 Refugee Act is, so the US in implementing the 1980 Refugee Act, they adopted the United Nations definition of a refugee. So they adopted that definition I just showed you. They also adopted this 1967 protocol on non-refoulement. So the United States said, by implementing this as a part of legislation, that they will not deport or expel any refugee who arrives at or within the borders of the United States who has a well-founded fear of persecution on account of those grounds until their case is fully evaluated. So this basically gives asylum seekers the right to remain in the United States through the duration of their asylum hearing, in order to go through that, to fully go through that process. This becomes really important in during the Trump administration, during the migrant protection protocols that were implemented. So I'll be coming back to this in a moment, but this was one of the other really significant international law declarations that were adopted through the 1980 Refugee Act. All right, so let me go back to this helpful slide, this helpful graph. So within the system of asylum, there are actually two kind of broad categories for asylum seekers. So affirmative asylum seekers are individuals who arrive at or within the borders of the United States with some valid visa. It could be a tourist visa, it could be a student visa, it could be family sponsorship visa, various elements. And they have the valid visa, and within a year of arriving in the United States, they make their application for asylum. So this means they're in good standing in terms of US immigration law, and their case is recognized as an affirmative case. So they're kind of given the burden of doubt. Instead of immediately going before an immigration judge, they speak with an asylum interviewer, an asylum official, and it's a less of a like defensive judicial system. If their case is denied by that asylum official, then it turns into a defensive process. They can appeal, and it can go into the defensive process. Defensive asylum seekers are individuals who arrive at or within the borders, but they don't have a valid visa, right? So these are undocumented migrants that arrive, individuals who overstay their visa, which is very common, right? So that maybe they were tourists or students first, but they overstay and then apply for asylum. And this system, this process is, I think, the most common. I mean, we see a lot of a defensive asylum process. It also becomes much more vulnerable in terms of the things that one might have to experience. So detention is quite common, being placed in a detention center. The other big thing here is that a defensive asylum case immediately goes before an immigration judge. And so already the burden of proof is kind of much higher for those asylum seekers. There's so many more complexities that I'm washing over, but hopefully this gives us a sense of the categories. The 1980 Refugee Act implemented this whole system. And so I think it's a really interesting piece of legislation for understanding how it is that these immigration processes today that we hear all things about, how they came to be. And it's interesting because the United States is one of the only countries in the world that has this sort of many-tiered system of how they're managing refugees who are admitted into the country. And it's certainly one of the only countries that has a judicial system, right? Like this process that's completely separate from the rest of the legal system. So the immigration courts are completely separate from like civil and criminal courts, very different judges, you know, like that sort of dimension is also really interesting, that the 1980 Refugee Act implemented this system. Okay, so now I want to talk about some changes that happened during the Trump era to the experiences of refugees and asylum seekers. And there were so many, right? The 4 years in which President Trump was in office was a whirlwind for changes to immigration policy in general. So one of the first things that we all heard about was talked about at first, the Muslim ban, right? And so barring individuals from particular countries, specific countries, from being able to arrive in the United States through any of the immigration systems. This kind of went back and forth through the courts. The final countries that were barred, that kind of made the list, are these countries. So Burma, Eritrea, Iran, Venezuela, Kyrgyzstan, Libya, North Korea, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, Tanzania, and Yemen. So, some of the original countries from the original Muslim ban list still remain. There were others that were added. I think what's important to recognize is that the majority of these countries are heavy or high refugee creating countries. So these are countries where there are a lot of individuals fleeing, right, out of fear of persecution. Civil wars are happening in those countries. There's general political instability. And so the neighboring countries around these places oftentimes are housing the majority of the refugees from those countries. To kind of give you a sense, so in 2016, so this was the final year of the Obama administration. So there were almost 86,000 refugees resettled in the United States, and these were the major countries that the resettlement was happening from. So Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, Burma, Iraq, Somalia. So you see a number of those countries then were put on that banned list, right? And so that becomes really interesting to notice. It's also really important to recognize that if we think about where are the world's refugees today, I mean, I think the numbers right now are like there are 65 million refugees in the world. The majority of the world's refugees are in neighboring countries, but they come from places like Somalia, Afghanistan, Syria, countries that ultimately made it on that list. And then where do those refugees end up? They end up in neighboring countries. So if we just think about Syrian refugees alone, where are Syrian refugees in the contemporary moment? The majority are in neighboring countries like Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan. A few years ago, there was this figure about, really looking at countries per capita, where are the world's refugees? And I think per capita in the United States, there are 0.08 refugees per 100,000 people. And in a country like Lebanon and Turkey, it was 400 refugees per 100,000 people. A place like Sweden, it was 11 refugees per 100,000 people. And so when we think about the rhetoric of, refugees overtaking the United States, it just doesn't bear out in reality if you look at the numbers. And so there's one of the disparities. A couple of other things that were implemented during the Trump era. So we learned a lot about the Remain in Mexico. It was, colloquially talked about as the Remain in Mexico policy. It's the migrant protection protocol. So basically what the Trump administration implemented is that rather than being able to arrive at or within the borders of the United States and stay, asylum seekers, non-Mexican national asylum seekers, had to remain in Mexico while the US evaluated their case. And so this kind of went in the face of that non-refoulement policy. It went in the face of international law and some of the stipulations that went along with that. We also learned a lot about family separation that happened at the border. About 5,000 children were separated from their parents. This is a policy that was struck down, but again, the aftermath of that policy still very much remains. And President Trump lowered the refugee cap. So President Obama had implemented a cap of 110,000 before he left office. Immediately, Trump lowered that to 50,000, and then later it was to 15,000. And so you really kind of see if we're looking at the refugee resettlement program, it basically goes down to zero, right, during 2020. And some of that certainly for COVID, but we can also kind of complicate that as well. And so the annual ceiling goes down to about 15,000. The number actually admitted is even lower than that. And again, if we're looking at like, where are those refugees coming from, you can see, a rise in South Asia, Near East Asia, that really diminishes in the last few years. I think for me, I'm always trying to pay attention to what's happening in Latin America and the Caribbean because of the neighboring country kind of thing. And you can see like, even that's always been very small, the number of refugees that are admitted from the Americas. And I'm happy to talk about that a little bit as well. Okay, a few other things that were implemented, and I'm going to go through these really quickly so I can move on to what's happened since Biden has taken office. So Trump implemented a policy where asylum seekers would be removed to safe third countries. So this is the idea is, if you first traveled through a country that's recognized as a safe country, you can effectively be deported back to the first safe third country. And so that was happening a lot to individuals from the Northern Triangle of Central America. So maybe you're from Honduras, but then you travel to Guatemala, you would be deported first to Guatemala. And so that was happening a lot. There was a lot of restrictions around work permits for asylum seekers. Some of these asylum cases can go on for years. And so certainly there's a need to be able to work, right, in the midst of that. And so the Trump administration really strongly restricted the ability for asylum seekers to receive work permits. There are a lot of restrictions on who is eligible for asylum. This happened a lot through the precedent of the court. So Attorney General Sessions at the time basically said, I think this was in 2018, said, if you're fleeing domestic violence, if you're fleeing gang violence, those are not grounds for persecution. So that was, I mean, in a lot of ways, that made it very challenging for individuals from Central America to successfully apply for asylum in the United States. Other elements to that as well, but there was just a lot of limiting of who could be eligible for asylum. There are policies that made it challenging for asylum seekers to have access to attorneys, just like attorneys' abilities to enter detention centers. The Remain in Mexico policy certainly did that and made it challenging for attorneys to, represent their clients. And there were policies that implemented the support of indefinite detention. So one strategy to dissuade individuals from moving through the asylum system was to detain them in detention centers indefinitely. And so we saw a lot of things around detention during the time. Okay, so under Biden, one of the, I think, well, I can't see fully my screen. Let me see if I can move this so I can see the first one. Oh yeah. Okay, so the refugee resettlement cap has increased. So it's increased to about a little bit more than 60,000 this year, and the intention is that the cap will raise to 125,000. That'll be the highest it's ever been since the foundation of the 1980 Refugee Act. So that'll be interesting. The travel bans have been lifted for those particular countries. President Biden has fortified the deferred action for child arrivals. So that's not really a program under the refugee and asylum protocol, but it is an immigration related program. And so that was really interesting to see. We saw also border wall funding was ended. So that was something that was implemented here. Something that I pay a lot of attention to, I'm doing a lot of research about what's happening to Central American migrants right now. And so to see that the migrant protection protocols were suspended, that was something that was helpful to pay attention to. And I can talk a little bit about what that means during the Q&A. The Biden administration also recently has implemented a family reunification task force. So for those children still who are not reunited with their families, there is now a task force to try to get those reunifications to happen more quickly. We've seen an increase in planning to make the immigration system run more smoothly and efficiently. A lot of this has meant hiring more immigration officers, more immigration officials, and folks at the Department of Homeland Security to do all of the processing of applications. And there's just so much documentation that goes into each immigration case. Even if you've married an immigrant, right, and you're trying to help the naturalization happen, there's so much documentation that goes with that. And so having more officials who can go through that process is really helpful. And recently, there was also talk about supporting a large immigration reform bill. We'll see what happens with that. Those bills are always, challenging in the political climate that we live in. But it is something that President Biden has supported, and we'll see. So we'll see what happens with that piece of legislation as it moves through all the various elements that it needs to move through. Okay, so I am going to stop now the share screen and let's talk. I'm really excited to hear what questions you have, and thanks so much for listening to this. And you can feel free to check, if you have questions in the chat you want to type, or raise your hand, or just turn your microphone on. I am happy to go with any of those methods. It all works. Looks like Jenna has a hand up, so I'll give you the floor.
Thanks. I'm just wondering if somebody wants to come into if somebody comes into the